Hello! You're listening to Season 1, Episode 3 of the Neurodissent podcast. I'm Nic Subterellu. I'm a neurodivergent scholar, writer, and social theorist, and I'm here with Molly Friesenborg.
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm a nonprofit professional. I work in education and racial justice and work tangentially to a lot of healthcare professionals and happen to be married to Nic.
So in this first season, Molly and I are exploring mental health through what I hope is an intriguing angle. Demons, demonic possession, exorcism, and other similar supernatural things that are supposed to affect our minds. The reason for this topic is that I want to explore a world before psychiatry, when people understood the body, the mind, and their possible afflictions differently. So far, we've explored both ancient Greece and also early Christianity.
Hypocrisy.
So in episode 2, we talked about Jesus Christ. In particular, we talked about him as an exorcist, as someone who could heal others from demonic possession. And in this way, he could relieve their distress. And interestingly, we also talked about how the writer of the Gospel of Mark seems keen to show Jesus Christ as a healer who is superior to Asclepius and Hippocrates.
The drama.
And we discussed Hippocrates and Asclepius in our first episode. And as you might remember, Hippocrates advocated that we view mental illness as being caused by natural causes. He argued against the idea of gods or demons being the cause of epilepsy and other afflictions. Asclepius was the god he and his followers were associated with. Both Asclepius and Hippocrates remained influential within the healing arts for nearly a millennium. The Hippocratic tradition, as well as the cult of Asclepius, are still thriving, or at least still present at the time of our story today. So our story today is going to focus on a man named Saint Jerome.
So are there still like Asclepiad temples, or just like the idea of it is like still popular at this time period?
I believe there are still Asclepiad temples in existence. At least for the beginning part of St. Jerome's life.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, so St. Jerome was an influential Christian scholar, and he lived from around 340 to 420 AD. So that's 300 to 400 years after Jesus, and about 700 years after Hippocrates. And during Jerome's lifetime, these so-called pagan gods like Asclepius were still present and quite prominent, but Jerome lived in a time when that was changing. He was alive during a time when Christianity was gaining a lot of power. In 380 AD, when he was about 40 years old, the Emperor Theodosius, made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire.
So it was a really good time to be alive for him.
Yes, right. So this is a very convenient thing for Jerome, and as a result, in about 2 years after that, in 382 AD...
so when you said Asclepiad temples were at least there for the first part, you're thinking maybe they weren't so popular after Christianity became the official.
Yes, as Christianity gains power, that's when they start to dismantle.
So we're at the very end of the Hippocrates' reign.
All right, so 2 years after Christianity became the official religion, Pope Damascus I hired Jerome to adopt the church's Latin versions of the gospel. So he's best known for his translation of the gospels into Latin.
I see. So in that way, he's still like impacted everything about Christianity after him, because he really had so much power in that moment.
He's very influential. He's commented on by other people that we'll talk about later in our history. He's very influential. He was a big deal at his own time, and he remains a big deal within the history of Christianity. So the first thing I want to talk about is the complicated relationship that Jerome had with Greek and Roman philosophy.
Okay.
So in Jerome's words, we're talking about the writing of pagans, or non-Christians. So on the one hand, Jerome views the text that these writers produced as heretical. He's worried that they can implant false ideas into the minds of good Christian believers. On the other hand, he's a well-educated scholar, and he's clearly read quite a bit of Greek and Roman philosophy, and he cites it extensively in his work.
Nice to see the way we talk about our, like, intellectual, like, what's the word? Our intellectual competition? I don't know. Hasn't changed since about the year 300.
So one of the things that we'll see is that he mentions Hippocrates and Asclepius in his writings often quite negatively. So in 384 AD, Jerome wrote a letter to a young woman he mentored named Eustochium. And he gives her...
That's a fun name.
It is a fun name, Eustochium. He gives her advice on how to be a pious Christian woman.
Oh, I think I'm going to love this.
Yeah, right. He's going to mansplain to her about how to live her life. Such letters were common practice at the time, and they were not necessarily private affairs. It was expected that such letters would be shared with associates, so Jerome appears to have put in a great deal of effort to craft these letters.
Okay.
In this
So
letter...
this wasn't off the cuff, basically, is what you're saying.
No, he doesn't just, like, write it off the cuff and then send it to her.
We could maybe forgive him for just a not-so-smart letter to a friend, but no, this was a very official document.
Yes, and he wants it to be read by other people, too, not just her. It's not a private thing. So he tells her not to seek to appear over-eloquent by reading and quoting from writers like Virgil or Cicero.
Men don't like smart girls. Continue.
Yep, and ironically, he does that all the time.
Well, yeah, he's a man, obviously.
Right. And he explains that we ought not to drink the cup of Christ and at the same time the cup of devils.
I mean, was someone selling devil juice? Like, I feel like...
Apparently Hippocrates was, or, I don't know, Cicero.
Oh, is it the opioids at the temple?
Maybe. So he provides a graphic description of his own struggles with reading Cicero and Virgil and other devils.
Devils.
Yes, the devils. So he writes, "Many years ago, when for the kingdom of heaven's sake, I had cut myself off from home, parents, sister, relations, and, harder still, from the dainty food to which I had become... to which I had been accustomed.
Miss my whole family, but really, it's the food. It's the food.
I mean, when you're starving yourself, I guess that's probably going to be your first
Fair
priority.
enough.
When I was on my way to Jerusalem to wage my warfare, I could not bring myself to forgo the library which I had formed for myself at Rome with great care and toil. And so, miserable man that I was, I would fast, only that I might afterwards read Cicero. And when at times I returned to my right mind and began to read the prophets, their style seemed rude and repellent. I failed to see the light with my blinded eyes."
I totally get that I am 1,300 years later, and I'm sure there's language and all these things, but, like, just the way he talks about himself, like, red flag. Like, anyone just, like, I don't know, there's something about the navel-gazing in that just makes me think, oh, this guy's not going to be a pleasant person to be around.
You know, I think you're right. So he goes on to explain how this problem that he had continued for some time. He's fasting so that he can read Cicero, and it's making him sick, really.
Yeah, not eating does that.
Right. He gets to a point where he's expected to die. And he writes...
I love that he's sharing his advice for a living.
Right.
Could barely keep his own ass alive.
"My body grew gradually colder, and the warmth of life lingered only in my throbbing breast. Suddenly I was caught up in the spirit and dragged before the judgment seat. Asked who and what I was, I replied, 'I am a Christian.' But he who presided said, 'Thou liest. Thou art a follower of Cicero and not of Christ. For where thy treasure is, there will thy heart be also.'"
Wow.
So he goes on to say that he woke from this experience with bruises.
Wow. I'm sorry, wait. He was asleep and the gods talked to him and he woke and knew how to do better. That actually sounds a lot like an Asclepian temple.
Right, but
I will take the opioids to go to sleep as opposed to almost dying. It sounds like we come to the same conclusion.
So he awakes from this experience with bruises and a renewed zeal for Christian scripture. He also pledges never to read Cicero and other pagan writers again. And so in this way, he suggests that Eustochium should not read them either.
Oh, I forgot this was a letter to, like, some other person. Wow. I recommend Near Death. It does wonders.
So, Jerome is an advocate of asceticism, which is an idea about purity, Christian purity, avoiding indulgences in order to be pure. So in another part of that letter to Eustochium, he actually describes an earlier part of his life where he lived as an ascetic hermit in the desert. So he's living in a way so as to avoid all indulgences. And here's what he writes. When I was living in the desert, in the vast solitude which gives to hermits a savage dwelling place, parched by a burning sun, how often did I fancy myself among the pleasures of Rome? I used to sit alone because I was filled with bitterness. Sackcloth disfigured my unshapely limbs, and my skin from long neglect had become as black as an Ethiopian's. Tears and groans were every day my portion, and if drowsiness chanced to overcome my struggles against it, my bare bones, which hardly held together, clashed against the ground. Of my food and drink I say nothing, for even in sickness, the solitaries have nothing but cold water, and to eat one's food cooked is looked upon as self-indulgence.
So, to remove the actual God and religious portion for a second, I'm just thinking about, like, the political leader here for a sec, right? Who was like, yes, we're doubling down, we're Christians now.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this guy who you put in charge, and, like, I'm just thinking about what a hard sell this is. Like, you went from, like, 2 years ago, the lead, like, taking care of yourself, well-being thing is, like, go to this amazing place where they have all this fun community and games, and, like, you're gonna get some opioids, and we're gonna, like, learn how to feel better, to starve yourself, take away anything that is self-indulgent in, like, the most extreme version, and never ever read a word by anything from the last 1,000 years of history. Like, that is a hard sell. And if I were that political leader, I'd be like, oh, I picked the wrong marketing person.
Yeah, well, you're not wrong. I mean, he's going to be, even though I said he was influential, he's not necessarily...
Doesn't make him popular.
Right, he's not necessarily universally beloved by any means. And perhaps the thing that makes him most controversial is the thing we're going to talk about next, which is his obsession with virginity.
Oh, yay. Love it.
So he most fervently defends the idea that being a good Christian meant not having sex.
You know, the only more important thing than depriving your own body is to make sure you can deprive other people's bodies.
In his letter to Eustochium, he describes how he was often tempted to have sex, even while living as a hermit in the desert. So we're gonna listen to him talk about his...
Oh, I don't think I want to.
Now, although in my fear of hell I had consigned myself to this prison, where I had no companions but scorpions and wild beasts, I often found myself amid groups of girls. My face was pale and my frame chilled with fasting, yet my mind was burning with desire, and the fires of lust kept bubbling up before me when my flesh was as good as dead. Helpless, I cast myself at the feet of Jesus. I watered them with my tears. I wiped them with my hair. And then I subdued my rebellious body with weeks of abstinence. I do not blush to avow my abject misery. Rather, I lament that I am not now what once I was. I remember how I often cried aloud all night till the break of day, and ceased not from beating my breast till tranquility returned at the chiding of the Lord.
I'm not gonna lie, I think I, like, blacked out halfway through that because I didn't want to hear it anymore. Life was so hard for your self-imposed crazy, Jerome. I'm sorry. It was probably the girl's fault for being there, too.
Oh, well, we will get to that. So, Jerome's also known for publicly criticizing other Christian writers whose views he sees as heretical. Yeah. In his book, Christianity, Book Burning, and Censorship in Late Antiquity, historian Dirk Roman discusses conflicts between different Christian scholars. Roman writes, rival Christian authors struggled for power among each other by attempting to define what books, including their own, were permitted in libraries.
They wanted to ban their own books from their own libraries?
Well, they wanted to promote their own books being allowed in libraries and argue against other people's books being allowed. And in particular, Jerome is a good example of someone who tried to criticize and discredit other people's writing as a way of using his reputation and influence to silence other people's teachings about...
I just really don't like him.
So, one of the Christian writers that Jerome was especially harsh toward was named Jovinian. And he writes an incredibly harsh critique of Jovinian. I'll go to theologian Katerina Paulson for a summary of their disagreement. So she writes, "The issues under debate concerned the value of asceticism in the life of a Christian. Jovinian, who was himself a monk, had argued that all baptized persons were equal. Ascetics were not closer to God than other Christians were. Jerome was among those who had introduced a more radical version of the ascetic life into the Latin world, and this did not go without opposition. Jovinian was one of those who turned against the idea of an ascetic elite separated from ordinary Christians, arguing instead for the unity of the church and the equality between the baptized."
Well, that makes a lot of sense because I definitely think Jesus was all about how do we put some people over other people and judge everyone who doesn't do exactly what we do.
Yeah, I at least based on the Gospel of Mark that we looked at, that doesn't seem to be part of those teachings, but...
I think you missed a couple things about stones.
So, one of Jerome's friends sent him copies of Jovinian's writings. And Jerome gets these copies, and he feels it necessary to respond to Jovinian's heretical ideas at length.
I get the sense Jerome always feels it necessary to respond.
Yeah.
At length.
So in
box 0.
In 393 AD, he published a response called Against Jovinian. And his response begins by insulting Jovinian's writing. He complains for paragraphs, very, very long paragraphs, about how hard it is to
y'all, if Nick calls them long, they're long.
So he just says that Jovinian's writing makes no sense for like 5 paragraphs. It's he even suggests that Jovinian is mad. He writes...
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he writes, "What I ask is the meaning of these portentous words, and of the
I'm sorry, you used the word pretentious like...
Not pretentious.
No, portentous. Yeah. I'm just saying, like, that in of itself is, like, the most pretentious thing in the whole world.
So, what I ask is the meaning of these portentous words and of this grotesque description. Would you not think Jovinian was in a feverish dream, or that he was seized with madness and ought to be put into the restraints which Hippocrates prescribed? However often I read him, even till my heart sinks within me, I am still in uncertainty of his meaning."
Wow. So his problem is Jovinian sounds like he's in a feverish dream, and he just wrote a letter about, like, the most important thing that ever happened to his life is, like, his, like, fever dream when he almost starved himself to death.
Yeah.
Hypocrite.
Consistency.
Hypocrite.
Anyway, after he complains about how hard it is to read, he acknowledges that he could make sense of it enough to critique it for another 300 pages or whatever. So,
and that page was, like, probably a whole scroll or something. Like.
That's a good point. Early on in the treatise, Jerome lists a few of Jovinian's claims that he finds objectionable, and the first one is this: "Virgins, widows, and married women who have been baptized, if they are on a par in other respects, are of equal merit." And it's this point that Jerome spends most of his first book arguing against.
Yes, focus on the women. Great.
So Jerome wants everyone to know that married women who have had sex with their husbands are not as pure as virgins, because they've had sex. He makes his point very clear. He writes,
"Get thee to a nunnery!"
The truth is that, in view of the purity of the body of Christ, all sexual intercourse is unclean.
It's fascinating that we are designed that way, then.
Oh, indeed. So
God made some interesting choices.
Classicist Warren S. Smith describes the way Jerome comes across in his treatise. He writes, "He achieves a narrative tone that is now reasoned, now hysterical, and finally rather sad and isolated." Smith describes Jerome's treatise as suggesting an obsessive trait, and that Jerome has a tendency to ramble on at length and give the appearance of letting his emotions control him when he is discussing the explosive issue of sexual relationships with women.
I feel like a week or a year in Asclepiad Temple would really do Jerome well.
I think so too, yeah. Jerome's taking a position that, even in his own time, was seen as very extreme, and the way he communicated his point was also seen as harsh by even his supporters. But this is what scholar of religion Elizabeth A. Clark wrote about the general consensus on Jerome's point at the time. Many Roman Christians, including wealthy aristocrats, faulted Jerome's renunciatory strictures as excessive. More congenial to them was a brand of Christianity that more warmly espoused family values. So Jerome ends up having to apologize.
Family values just mean getting to have a family?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And, caring for them and loving them, all that.
But you had to create them first. Is really the big difference here.
Definitely, yes. So Jerome apologizes, or he has to apologize to one of his friends named Pomacius. So he writes a letter to Pomacius. Pomacius was the person who sent him Jovinian's books in the first place, but Pomacius got mad at Jerome's harsh critique. So Jerome writes a lengthy letter in response to Pomacius, and it has some semblance of an apology, but mostly he just explains why he's right.
The non-apology apology.
Oh yes, it's a 19 long paragraph, or it's 19 paragraphs long, and he re-explains his point from the book to his friend, who surely already read the book, and perhaps even agrees with him because he sent him this thing in the first place. Let me read to you the end of his letter. Jerome writes, "With my last breath, then, I protest that neither now nor at any former time have I condemned marriage. I have merely answered an opponent without any fear that they of my own party would lay snares for me. I extol virginity to the skies, not because I myself possess it, but because not possessing it, I admire it all the more."
I started to imagine Jerome as like a Hamilton-esque figure in the musical. It's like, write him way out. Write his way out. Like he's just going to keep writing until his hand falls off and he's going to win because more is more.
I mean, that's an interesting point in the sense that, like, we actually don't know anything about Jovinian other than what Jerome told us. So in some sense, Jerome
is this famous because he just wrote so much. It survived.
Right, and he was able to use his power to influence the way that other people took up or didn't take up certain books. Jovinian's books were not taken up because of Jerome.
And therefore, we don't really know much about them.
We don't really know much about him other than Jerome hates him.
Oh, powerful men who hate everyone. How they've shaped history.
All right. Well, let's get on to the demons.
Yes, please.
The demons.
I've been waiting for it.
Heck yes. So we're going to talk about another piece of Jerome's writing. This is it's a biography of Saint Hilarion, who is one of Jerome's friends. Jerome wrote this in 390 AD, so it actually came before Against Jovinian. The life of Saint Hilarion is one of Jerome's biographies of great Christians. He wrote a few other ones too. And Saint Hilarion was an ascetic monk who lived in much the same way that Jerome apparently did.
Or at least described.
Right. So the life of Saint Hilarion is in many ways a text that is intended to promote the type of ascetic life that Jerome valued.
All right, so we should all be Hilarions.
Exactly.
That's hilarious.
So interestingly, Jerome describes Hilarion as a great healer and exorcist. Jerome writes, "The old man was enabled by grace to tell from the odor of bodies and garments, and the things which anyone had touched, by what demon or with what vice the individual was distressed." So in other words, Hilarion could smell demons in your body odor.
Ew.
So Jerome says that Hilarion was superior to physicians at the time.
Well, I literally was just thinking, well, Hippocrates would throw some shade at that skill. So, all right, it's only fair he's throwing it back.
Well, I don't know. I mean, they couldn't smell demons in your body odor.
Yes, I believe he called that charlatanism.
So, Hilarion is able to heal several people who physicians could not heal.
According to Jerome.
According to Jerome. At one point in the story, Hilarion tells a blind woman, "If you had given to the poor what you have wasted on physicians, the true physician, Jesus, would have cured you." He then spat in her face, which seems to be a reference to Jesus putting saliva on a man's eyes in the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, that's the same.
I know, it's...
I mean, if we're talking about them like, as healthcare providers, like, what a delightful contrast.
Exactly.
I, gently anointed your eyes. I spat in your face.
It does kind of, I think, give the kind of aggressiveness that Jerome's take on all of this has to it. So, in Jerome's tale, Saint Hilarion exorcises demons from 7 people and 1 camel.
Okay.
So, I'm going to discuss 2 of these.
Camels are kind of notoriously, mean buggers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
They like to spit in your face.
So I'm going to discuss 2 of these exorcisms, not the camel one.
Dang.
The first one is very similar to the others.
We have to do, a special, on the Patreon take or something. For just the camel story.
That's right, yes. Special
Subscribe
feature.
and get the camel story. No.
So, the first of these exorcisms is very similar to all the others, and then this second one that we'll talk about is very different. So the first story...
As in the other 6 that we're not talking about.
Yes, right. So we're going to ignore the other 6. But in our first story, Hilarion exorcises demons from a wealthy citizen named Orion.
Okay.
He was possessed by a legion of demons, and that word legion there should make us think of the Gospel of Mark, and indeed Orion seems very much like the demoniac of Gerasene.
Okay. Sending the pigs into the sea, in case anyone's struggling to remember which one we're talking about.
Yep. So, Jerome describes Orion as raging mad and hard to control. Hands, neck, sides, feet were laden with iron, and his glaring eyes portended an access of raging madness.
Well, yeah, he was totally incapacitated by iron. I'd be raging mad too.
So Orion sees Hilarion and breaks free from his restraints. He rushes over to Hilarion and immediately picks him up, which causes everyone to freak out and try to save Hilarion, who's old and frail from fasting, so they're worried about him. But Hilarion smiles and says, "Be quiet and let me have my rival in the wrestling match to myself." So Hilarion just lifts up Orion, places him in front of him, and shouts, "To torment with you, ye crowd of dormans," or ye crowd of demons, to torment.
Dormans.
Dormans.
The army of Dormans is inside you.
Orion's head fell back to the ground, and Hilarion shouts, "Lord Jesus, release this wretched man, release this captive, thine it is to conquer many, no less than one." So at this point, out of Orion's mouth come many different voices, the confused shouts of a multitude, and from then on, Orion was freed of the demons. So later, Orion comes to the monastery to try to give Hilarion gifts of thanks, but Hilarion refuses them. And Orion suggests that Hilarion can take the gifts and give them to the poor, but Hilarion still refuses and says, "You can best distribute your own gifts, for you tread the streets of the cities and know the poor." And Orion is sad about this, but Hilarion insists that he can't accept any gifts, and he says, "Be not sad, my son. What I do for my own good, I do also for yours. If I were to take these gifts, I should myself offend God, and moreover, the legion would return to you."
It's interesting that, the money piece is the only part that, reminds me of Jesus.
Yeah.
Everything else is, this aggressive, combatant perspective, which feels so counter to, what
Right.
I know of Jesus' approach to dealing with people. But at least he's yeah, and you can't keep your money,
Right.
and I don't do this for money. That's the only piece that, feels like it's actually in line with the teachings.
I definitely agree that part about the money, really makes it clear that this kind of healing practice only works if it's done freely and given freely. But
I spit in your face.
But I spit in your face, and there's a wrestling match that Hilarion apparently wins. I mean, it's definitely turns up the violence from the Book of Mark.
and I didn't hear anything in any of those stories that like reminded me of care for the whole person or loving the person or trying, you know what I mean? Accepting them in any way.
All right, so let's go on to our second story. So this is the story that isn't like the others. And in this one, Jerome talks about a young woman. So one of the ways this is different is that this is the only story where a woman or a girl is possessed. All the other ones are
I'm
men.
going to go ahead and guess that this is... Well, anyways, go ahead. Never mind.
That they're somehow going to control this woman's choices and...
Well, yeah, I mean, like, it's the only woman. Okay, this has to do with her sexuality. Let's go.
Yes, indeed.
Nailed it.
So this young woman is described as one of God's virgins.
There we go.
And Jerome writes that a young man in Gaza was apparently attracted to this woman, and he had used all the tricks he had to seduce her. Jerome explains that he had already tried those touches, jests, nods, and whispers which so commonly lead to the destruction of virginity.
And women's, because, you know, apparently men, it doesn't count.
Yeah.
Wait, hey, at least Jerome also thought men were responsible for being virgins or whatever. Like,
yeah, I mean, he does.
It wasn't just women who had to not have sex. That's something.
Technically, yes, he does, but he does still seem to spend more time worrying about women's virginity than...
Fair. I mean, not fair, but, like, unsurprising.
Right. Like, he admits himself he's not a virgin. If you remember.
He already isn't a virgin. The hypocrisy. Okay.
The young man is not ready to give up, so he goes to a magician to learn how to control the young woman. Interestingly, Jerome claims the magician was a priest of Asclepius.
I'm guessing he would not describe himself as a magician.
So Asclepius claims, Asclepius, Jerome claims, does not heal souls, but destroys them.
Oh, them's fighting words.
So the young man completes...
Fight that the Asclepius lost.
The young man completes a year of training with this magician, and then returns to bury magical items under the young woman's house. Afterwards, the young woman becomes distressed. And Jerome writes...
She's a stalker. Yeah, that's distressing.
Well, I think we have to ask ourselves whether she has a stalker or whether she has some kind of affection for this young man, but that the people around her don't want her to have affection.
That's... Yeah, so she's distressed because... y'all just let me marry this dude already?
Yeah, or, you know, I'm not entirely sure, honestly, which it is. Yeah.
Because Jerome didn't care.
Because Jerome doesn't care, right? Jerome writes, thereupon the maid began to show signs of insanity, to throw away the covering of her head, tear her hair, gnash her teeth, and loudly call the youth by name. Her intense affection had become a frenzy. So the story suggests that the young woman has feelings for the young man, but that they're caused by a demon that only enters her after the young man uses evil Asclepius magic.
Or alternatively, she's only desperately calling out for the guy she loves and, like, gnashing her teeth because
people won't let her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only after it's been, like, 2 years of this has she...
So the young woman's parents reach out to get the help of an exorcist, and they take her to see Hilarion. And when she arrives in front of Hilarion, the demon immediately begins to howl and confess, claiming he's the real victim in this situation. So the demon says he was forced to do it by the young man. And Hilarion asks the demon why he entered the young woman, and the demon says to preserve her as a virgin. And so Hilarion dismisses what the demon says as lies.
That he was trying to preserve her virginity as a lie.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Demons, from their perspective, soundly don't do that.
So, right, yeah. So he's a liar. The demon is a liar. So the thing that makes this story so different from the other exorcism stories in the life of Saint Hilarion is the way Jerome has his character, Hilarion, talk to the woman who is possessed by a demon. Specifically, Jerome writes that Hilarion sharply rebuked the virgin for having, by her conduct, given an opportunity for the demon to enter.
1,300 years ago, she was still asking for it.
That's right. This is the only exorcism story where Hilarion blames the victim for having some part in their possession.
Nice.
It is also the only case where a woman is possessed. All of the other cases are men, well, except for the
Campbell.
Campbell.
It's not their fault.
And it's not their
fault.
fault.
It's not the Campbell's fault. But the woman, she's to blame. Wow. We haven't changed at all, have we?
But definitely not. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
people be people.
Those are our exorcism stories. I want to start.
I'm going to give those a big old, bad healthcare practices thumbs down.
Oh. You want to do a Yelp review of Hilarion?
I mean, no. Because,
No.
the problem with even that is I'm like, I don't believe you that you fixed anything based on the way you're writing about it. I just, yeah. No trust.
All of that trust that we felt from the Gospel of Mark, there's definitely a lot of similarity between the Gospel of Mark and Jerome. When we talked about Orion, we noted all the Legion and all that
the
stuff.
The wrestling and the spitting
and there's still a sort of attempt to one up Hippocrates and Asclepius, but Jerome just takes it to a whole other level, right?
Well, yeah, and again, one of the things that stood out to me in Mark was and now go back to your community and spread this, right? And it just really highlights that difference of the reason and that blame is never going to get you to go back and be accepted by the community, right? There's no talk of what we need to do about the community that buried the student iron.
Yeah, and one wonders if Jerome even supports the notion of building a community.
Yeah.
I mean, does he want you instead?
No, it sounds like you're supposed to be isolating in the desert.
Yeah, that's no good.
I'm not quite sure what the purpose of life is at that point, but
yeah. So if we go and we try to think about what Foucault said, Foucault tells us that prior to the rise of psychiatry, people were more willing to take seriously the things that mad people said. And they had different ways of talking about this. So if we think about demonic possession as a way of talking about madness, then we can ask ourselves if this is, like you said, is this a good way of caring for these people? And it seems like we shouldn't romanticize demonic possession as necessarily caring, because Jerome's case clearly makes the demons into something that perhaps doesn't liberate, especially the young woman, but rather puts limits on what she's supposed to do.
Yeah, and blames what could be really normal behavior on them.
Right.
Yeah. All right, well, I gotta say, Asclepiad Temple, exorcised by Hilarion, gonna go with the temple. Even if I have to pay a chicken.
Indeed. So Jerome seems to portray women as uniquely threatened by demons. Apparently.
Shocker.
Yeah, right. Apparently because of the fires of lust burning in men. And still he seems to hold women responsible.
Jerome, you're the worst. You're just the worst. And I mean, I'm sure he didn't start it. I'm sure we were already blaming and hating women for men's lust before St. Jerome. But man, it's hard not to see what he did, his role in setting Christianity up on a very long path of that.
You know who would agree with you? About 1,000 years later, after Jerome's life, many people would begin to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church. One of those people was the renowned priest Martin Luther. And he had this to say about Jerome.
Ooh, let's hear it.
I know no writer whom I hate as much as I do Jerome.
Yes.
All he writes about is fasting and virginity. And that's really where I want to leave our discussion of St. Jerome.
Go Martin Luther! All right. I think in summary, Jerome, take your ass home.
We're going to wrap up this episode then, and we hope you'll listen to our next episode when we fast forward into the late Middle Ages in England.
Jumping.
And we're going to talk about Marjorie Kemp and her fascinating and bizarre book and all the demons in it.
Women get to write books?
Women get to write books, and in fact, we're going to talk about more than one woman who wrote a book. Whoa.
Jerome would be so pissed.
So I want to remind our listeners to visit our website, nsupterelu.com, or just Google neurodissent. And on our website, you'll find information about our podcast, including materials that are open access, and you can go read for free. So,
but don't read Jerome.
or do. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, Until next time.
Bye.